Good morning or afternoon. It's really great to have you here. Today is a very special, unique program on a impressive and, shall we say, somewhat controversial series of wins by the Singularism Church in Utah. We'll talk more about all that in a few minutes, but one of the things I wanted for this seminar today was to show the backing of the churches that are involved in the psychedelic movement, to show just how far we've actually gone despite some very slow times and setbacks. We here today, just on the screen, have among our speakers have 11 different religions. 7 of those are mainstream religions. So the process of the infusion of the psychedelic movement into both the novel churches, some of the more ancient peyote and ayahuasca churches, the Eleusinian mysteries, and now mainstream churches as they begin to absorb the truth of what many of us have been practicing for years. This is an exciting time. We're going to start with some invocations, blessings, whatever you want to call them, sharings today by several very important people to me and to the plant movement who've had real success in bringing this ancient gospel to the public and to the rest of us working in the movement. First will be Karina Bashir. Karina is an attorney with Antithesis Law and is on the board of directors of the Psychedelic Bar Association, as many of us here today are, where she's also a steward of the very important and active Religious Use Committee. Karina is passionate about Islamic mysticism and researches questions at the intersection of Islamic thought, esotericism, and non-ordinary consciousness. Karina will share a blessing today passed on to her by one of her mentors. Thank you, Karina.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And it is an honor to be here today. And as John said, I'm so grateful to be able to offer this blessing brought forward to me by one of my mentors. And to, in my role in this space as an advocate and in other roles I hold, to be part of what many of us are here to do and contribute to, which is continuing to bring spirit and spirituality really into the world of this movement and this ecosystem as it develops. So thank you so much, and it's an honor to be here. Assalamu alaikum. And this is a prayer of shared humanity, and I offer this prayer in the deep knowing that every soul is worthy of care, of dignity, and of compassion. The sacred breath of life moves through all creation, within every person, every being, and every moment. And it is this shared spirit that binds us as one human family, here today and always. May we open our hearts to one another, extending kindness and strength to the vulnerable, the weary, the unseen, and all that may find comfort in renewal. May we remember that each of our traditions holds wisdom for healing, and that together we help light the path toward wholeness and peace for all. I honor the sacredness of this gathering and the presence of spirit among and within all of us. And as we enter this space today, coming from all of the different backgrounds that we hold, both personally and professionally, the different opinions and experiences, that we truly step into this with the heart and desire to listen with an openness, to speak with courage and gentleness with one another, and to grow in understanding, compassion, and love. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Thanks so much, Karina. Thank you. I know you have to go. I hope you'll get the recording, and maybe we'll talk later. Thanks again.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Now we have Mira and Alex. Mira and Alex have the honor, I guess, of teaching a lot of us the word entheism. One of my clients and then Mira and Alex showed me that word, and I got so tired of saying entheogenic church or entheogenic religious organization or whatever. So I've started using that term, and it seems to be catching on. And even though Mira is the only bio here, Mira and Alex, both their bios are at this link. So now I'm going to turn it over to Mira and Alex with many thanks for being here today.
Thank you so much, John.
Thank you.
And hello, everyone. It's an honor to be here. Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, we're going to share our blessing here. Welcome to all who have joined. We gather here in community in support of cognitive liberty and the freedom of spiritual exploration. Let us take a deep breath together. In through the heart, out through the field that connects us all. We gather to remember who we truly are, expressions of one consciousness, meeting itself through countless eyes. May this space be one of truth, humility, and awakening. May each voice that speaks do so from clarity, compassion, and courage. May each who listen do so with openness and grace. We give thanks to our ancestors.
We acknowledge the long lineage of seekers, teachers, and healers whose light made this moment possible. And we dedicate our time together to the evolution of consciousness, the healing of the human heart, and the realization of unity in diversity. As we begin, let us silently offer gratitude for the breath, for the body, for the mystery that brought us here. May wisdom flow freely, may connection deepen, and may love, the source of all things, guide our words, our thoughts, and our gathering today. So it is.
So it is. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Alex. Thank you, Mira. Solana agreed to exchange places with Bob Otis because he has to leave early. So Bob Otis of the Sacred Garden Community will give our next blessing. By the way, Sacred Garden Community is my church. So special thanks to Bob for being here.
Yeah, and thank you, John, for organizing this, and Singularism for all the hard work you've done, and those who made right decisions regarding Singularism. I'm feeling a lot of fullness in my heart just being here with this diverse group, with all of these different incoming, we could say lineages or fractalages, all the incoming ways that are here. Sacred Garden Community is an interfaith church. We really hope to hold a diversity of ways. And I'm just thinking about, I've also was really appreciating the invocations coming in, thinking about elders, those who have gone before us, some still living, many who have passed. In sort of my continental heritage, I just want to really honor and express gratitude to Ann and Sasha and Christian Roch and dear Amanda Fielding and Terrence and Jonathan Ott and all of those who have come before us and shown us ways north, south, east, and west, all coming together here. And just to read a little quote from Albert Hoffman, who is an interesting character, a great chemist who discovered LSD. He was fond of saying, if a chemist does not become a mystic, then he is not a chemist either. So may we be seeing the joining of the ways, even in this conversation. And with that, even using that prayer in a way that I hope would be interfaith. For some, there may be materialist atheists on the call, and something about these, what I call sacraments, can even bring that sacred experience to all of us. So I just want to express gratitude in a interfaith, non-sectarian prayer that we can be here. What a miracle this is. Thank you that we can be here, that you're there and that I'm here, that many of us can see or hear. Probably all of us can feel sensations on our skin or in our body. We can even feel our breath. What a miracle. What a miracle. I hope we can all just feel all that we can even be here in gratitude, and may the time we're spending together bring us deeper into the heart of whatever is sacred to each of us from our traditions. Amen. Aho. Ashe. Bila Kaifa. Hayaya.
Thank you, Bob. Perfect segue. I thought for a minute you weren't going to ring the bell there. Anybody knows you knows we got to get the bell in there, or some ringing. So thank you. And that leads nicely into Deepak, who will give us our final blessing, and then I'll give an introduction, and then we'll dive right in. Deepak.
Thank you. So this is a wonderful experience to be here today. I'm going to chant a couple of mantras that I usually chant at the beginning of the semester with my classes. And you might be familiar with some of these. So I'm going to chant the mantra and give a translation. So the first one is Gayatri Mantra, which I'm sure many of you have heard of already. So let me chant that. Om Bhur Bhuva Swaha Tatsavitur Bharenyam Bhargo Devasya Dhimahi Dhyoyo Na Prachodayat. Translation. We meditate on the adorable glory of the radiant sun. May she inspire our intelligence. Then this next mantra is one that's a little unusual, but it's chanted before all kinds of classes in Hinduism, in the Hindu context. And I chant it before my classes when I teach in the beginning of the semester. Om Saha Navatu Saha Nav Bhunaktu Saha Viryam Karavavahai Tejasvi Navadhitamastu Ma Vidvishavahai Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. So the translation here is something that you may not expect. So may we study together. May our study be something that we enjoy and that we are devoted to. And may our study produce something that has tremendous energy, right? Finally, and this is probably the most unusual thing about it, is that may our study not give us any enmity towards one another. Peace, peace, peace. I think it's a nice way to bring us all together. Anyway, thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Deepak. Never a dull moment. Thank you for sharing with us those ancient chants. Okay, we're a little bit behind schedule here, so I'm going to keep my introduction real short. We spent a lot of time putting this program together, and I want to thank Laura Appelman of Willamette Law School, who was not able to be here today. She and Jay graciously took her place at the last minute due to a family sort of crisis. I'll introduce the speakers as we go through, but you have those linked. The basic intention today is to help us all learn what the singularism decisions are and are not, and then to potentially look at the path forward, including some of us on the line potentially helping singularism with one or more amicus briefs. We can talk about that later. The one decision we did make here was to keep the questions till the end, and we've given quite a bit of time for that. We've given 15 minutes specifically for Q&A. The reason we decided not to do it on the fly is because all these speakers have relatively short time periods to speak, and unless they want to end early and open it up to questions, get us your questions, mostly get them to Alyssa, and we'll try to get to everything. We may not get to everything, but we'll try to group the most, kind of the most burning, recurring questions that people bring up. And with that, I'll introduce Bridger. Bridger has become a friend and a hero of mine in the last few months. I'm excited about what singularism is. I'm excited about this win, these series of wins. And most of all, I'm just excited to introduce you to Bridger himself, who, unlike most of the rest of us, thank God, has actually spent time in prison or in jail for his beliefs here. And I must say, Bridger, maybe you can tell us more about it, but I wish I'd been there to see that moment when the Utah police handed you your mushrooms back. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Bridger.
Unmute, friend.
Unmute, Bridger.
Oh, there we go.
There you go.
You guys, to everybody here, I want to say thank you so much. I am absolutely humbled and in just a lot of gratitude that we have gotten so much support. It truly has been humbling, this entire experience, and in many ways. I do feel the need to say one thing, and that is that I have been lucky to have been detained, but not to have served prison time. Actually, I was fortunate enough, and so I just thought I'd mention that. But no wonder John likes me and respects me so much. It had been a lot worse if I had this year, but I have been through the ringer. They raided our detention center. They raided our wellness center. not our detention center. I don't run a detention center, but they raided our wellness center. They detained me. They questioned me. We filed a lawsuit, and then we won a temporary restraining order against the local municipalities, and then in the after we won the TRO, and Tanner will walk you through some more of our wins, but after we won a restraining order against the government from the federal government, we thought we won. We were so lucky. We were so fortunate and blessed. And then the next week, there was a flurry of aggressive filings. They asked for, on the 23rd of December, they asked for an expedited discovery process. They wanted to interrogate all of us over the holidays. They asked for millions more in funding to prosecute us. Then they filed more appearances from different lawyers. At the same day, same week or time, they then filed charges to put me in prison for up to 15 years, as well as a number of other charges that the judge later called retaliatory, absolutely retaliatory for us, for our win. They asked for lists of every time. They asked for a list of any time I've ever done drugs in the last 8 years and any example of that. And then they asked for all the names of all my participants and voyagers and followers, which the judge called offensively broad. And she said, you guys are just clearly trying to make a civil lawsuit into your criminal investigation. She sealed the records without being asked, which Tanner, my lawyer, who will come on in a moment, said he's never seen before. And then we had another hearing. I want to recognize that there were a lot of Singularism members that were in these hearings that aren't here today. I even had my parents watching. It felt like the stakes were very high. So you're not wrong, John, that we've been through the ringer this year. Absolutely, that's correct. Now, since then,
if I could, Bridger, if I could, because Tanner's going to talk so much about the law, I actually, somebody called me literally before this program and says, what is a singularism?
okay.
So don't assume that people know what a singularism is. That's all.
Well, singularism, let me define it right now. And I have this Venn diagram in the background that I'd like to show you. And let me share screen for a moment. But before I do, let me just say, singularism is a multi-universal religion, or a religion of the multiverse. I believe to take, if you'd say that Descartes took the challenge of reality to the next level, to an extreme level, I would say we are taking universal religions to an extreme level and claiming that we are all correct, even in our contradictions. And I'd like to explain that a little. I'd like to say that psychedelics is a key ceremony that Singularism utilizes. When I say psychedelics, I mean several, but primarily psilocybin. And so that we utilize to break down our constructs and barriers. And we do so with being clinically influenced. My background is as a therapist. So let me jump right into what it is, and I'll share it with you here. Now, some people, and I'm going to have to turn the other way. So don't mind if I'm facing the wrong direction for a moment. Let's see, I have to share screen again, and share screen, that screen. All right. So can you guys see this all right here?
Can you zoom in? Oh, there you go.
Okay. So you can see this well. This is a Venn diagram. If you look at the red, you have religion, Christianity, Judaism, things that are classically religion. I actually left the names of influencers of each of these religions, and of course there's many more. If I would have known where to place every one of the 11 religions on this, I would have put you all somewhere, but I didn't know exactly where everyone goes or where you'd identify yourselves. But these are major world religions that if you're wondering where Buddhism is on that, it's because Buddhism might be kind of down here uh, between philosophy and religion. Buddhism famously doesn't exactly fit the mold, but I believe these organizations usually do. But I just heard that there's a Islamic metaphysicist on here and doing Islamic mysticism on here. So I'm going, okay, you can identify where you belong. I don't call these hard and fast, but what I say is here are famous philosophers that were strictly open that they are not religious. And then here up here we have clinical and social scientists that would say we are neither philosophical nor are we religious. We are clinicians. And so these are some people belong there. In the middle of each, you have people like Kierkegaard, Martin Buber, and Thomas Aquinas. They are both philosophical and religious. And there are many other examples I left off, but I put some of the obvious and conspicuous ones there. In between religious and clinical, we put St. Mary's Hospital, because look at St. Mary's, funded by and subsidized by a religious organization, and at the same time, they're extremely clinical. William James, Notre Dame, and my alma mater, BYU. I hope that that's mentionable, but it's a good example of a religious institution that has clinical research going on. And so now, of course, the question right here is, okay, who would say they belong in all three? Carl Jung, his entire life, was criticized for being too religious by the medical community. But Carl Jung was also criticized by people like Martin Buber right here for being not religious enough. And he's kind of throwing his hands up in the air, being like, I can be who I want. I can do the things I want. He's also clearly very influenced by philosophy. Nietzsche was very openly, Carl Jung, as religious and compassionate as he was not a nihilist, but he was very influenced by, of course, Freud, and he was very influenced by Nietzsche. And Carl Jung belongs squarely in that category. So does Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor, was a clinician before the Holocaust, survived being in the Holocaust, and then became a famous existentialist, which is, of course, philosophical, and was deeply religious at the same time. And while being formally a religion, I want to say singularism fits into all of these categories. I am deeply, deeply influenced by multiple religions, and including my own upbringing, which is a religion I don't necessarily ascribe to everything from. But, I was talking to Izzy with Maps not long ago, or listening to a podcast and then speaking with him. And he explained he was raised in Islam as well, but very philosophical. He's a lawyer, and he also respects all the sciences, and so he felt very much the same way. I am sure there are others on this call that say, well, I'm deeply influenced by my religion. So singularism belongs in the intersection of these things, and certainly we claim to be religious in sincerity. Now, this is what was challenged by us, and it is confusing to some people because they go, well, are you a religion, or are you using a loophole of religion? And I want to address that. And how many minutes do I have left, John? 3?
3 minutes. Yeah.
3
Of
minutes.
course, on the other hand, since the next guy is your lawyer, he's in no position to tell you to shut up. So,
okay, I'll wrap this up fast. But what I'll say is, first of all, if you all want in a week and a half, or I guess it's about a week and a half, or about 12 days away, I'm having a hour-long seminar on what singularism is, where it belongs, and going into a deep dive of our beliefs. I defend our beliefs with classical philosophical argument, and I believe in classical philosophical argumentation. And I think a good religion should have faith, and a good religion should be able to, I would say a modern religion should be able to defend itself on its own merits and grounds. We believe in a moral code. We believe in that a new definition, or rather an all-encompassing definition of God, is necessary. And we believe in that. Well, let me say it this way. All of those people that I just mentioned were influenced by the professions of their time. And what I said in court was, I said, well, Jesus, famously the founder of Christianity, although I'm not sure how you'd feel about Christianity as it stands today, all of it. But I think Jesus, the founder of Christianity, was profoundly influenced by his profession of carpentry. And so a lot of his metaphors turned out to be, well, both about carpentry, like moats and beams, and other professions of the time. He talked about shepherding and professions like that. He talked about fishing and fishers of men. He even talked about the bread of life and the water of life. And the metaphors of his time were relevant to the founding of what became Christianity. And they are deep and profound metaphors to this day. And I would say a founder of a religion today, all of us on here, if we're all that, we should and have the right to be influenced by our day and the age in which we're founding this in. And so I am profoundly influenced by both the philosophers that precede me, the social scientists that I look up to so much, and the clinicians that I look up to so much, and neuroscientists certainly influence singularism, and of course the religions of our day. We have in brevity advanced epistemology that I was so humbled and flattered when a member of Harvard Divinity School, who's on this call and can speak for himself in a moment, said it was a modern hermeneutical tool. And I was like, wow, that's the highest level of compliment. And I want to say that this entire experience has certainly been humbling for me. When the judge came and said that we appear to be what she calls existentially humble, she said, just because they don't have and fit the criteria of religion, and I'll take one more minute on this, Tanner, because it might lead well into what you have to say, but when she looked at the definition of religion as established in the Myers criteria, one of the requirements is that you have to claim to know the answers to life's biggest questions. And when the opposition was cross-examining me, they said, Bridger, are you a prophet? That was one of the other criteria. And do you know the answers to life's biggest questions? And I said, I am no more or less of a prophet than everyone else who comes through our doors. Every member in our religion is a prophet. And so then they said, well, do you know the answers to life's biggest questions? And I said, of course not. No, I'm not even going to pretend to. I am very tired of religions pretending, or any organization pretending to know the answers to life's biggest questions. And the next thing I said was, and anybody who claims they do is the scam artist you're looking for. And on sincerity, she ruled that we are clearly sincere. I think we answered questions so transparently, even to the opposition, that they were laughing. They're like, he's saying exactly what we're saying. Do you see, Your Honor? They're not a religion. And the judge looked at this and said, rather than saying that they know the answers to life's biggest questions, which is the definition of religion, she said, I have the power to expand the definition of religion. And I'm going to expand it to include existential humility. And I am not going to hold it against them. In fact, she called it the fact that we don't claim to know all of the answers to life's biggest questions. She said, we're going to call that a feature of this religion, of singularism. This is a good moment. Now that was more than we had even expected. She said, first of all, they do fit the Myers criteria, but then she ruled that existential humility ought to also be included in a good definition of religion. And then she ruled us to have been found to be existentially humble. And I ironically couldn't be more proud of that. That was the honor of my life. And I'm like, I know how ironic it sounds, but I'm not above that to be happy and proud for a few minutes of expanding the definition of religion with singularism. And that is what law periodicals have in particular been interested in. They've been interested that we have expanded the definition of religion. Reason Magazine and a couple of other law periodicals have picked up on this. I think the other honor of all the media, and then I'm turning it over to Tanner, was when a hate article came out about me in the Federalist. They attacked me. They said that Harvard organized an entire conference to support us, which wasn't true. It was a conspiratorial thing in the Federalist. Look it up. It's hilarious.
Hey, Bridger?
Yes.
If I could, man, we've got a whole speaker on existential humility alone. So
okay. So the last thing,
yeah, thanks.
I'll close by just saying that that those law periodicals published about that and the expansion of the definition of religion. And so I'll move on with that. And thanks so much for being here, everybody.
And by the way, Bridger, you and Tanner, we carved out a separate time at the end in addition to the Q&A. So between the Q&A and that, you'll have more time to fill in later. But we just have some pretty unique expert speakers today I want to make sure to get to. So Tanner, everybody look at Tanner's bio. It's kind of cool because Tanner's not a religious rights litigator mostly. He's out there doing, employment law and pretty, standard stuff, but he also has been involved since law school with all kinds of civil rights work. I suspect mostly pro bono. And he also would like our help with the amicus briefs potentially in December, but I'll let him speak to all that when he talks to us about his strategy in this case, which obviously was incredibly well vindicated, at least now before we hit the 10th Circuit, which is another big reason we're having this seminar. Thank you, Tanner. Take it away.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Bridger. I've been impressed with Bridger as I've gone through this, just how well and sincere of a person he has been and has thought through. I could talk for days and days, of course, about the sincerity of Singularism as a religious group, and also, the many tenets of their religion, which they have encapsulated both in the framework that Bridger has just mentioned to you, and also in the many tenets and belief systems and practices they have documented and which were demonstrated to the court. Like John said, I am principally a labor and employment attorney and an appeals attorney, but I do have a lot of background in religious liberty issues and well connected with the religious liberty community, and that is mainly my background in coming to this particular case. However, I've been very glad to meet so many in this community over the past 2 years. One of my core beliefs is that religious liberty and protecting religious liberty for anyone protects religious liberty for everyone. And that's something Bridger and I spoke about very early on. And I think it's true as a legal principle, and I think it's true also just as a human principle. And even if I were just completely selfishly taking on the case to advance that principle for my own rights as a religious minority, myself as a Latter-day Saint in the United States, I would stick to that principle. And so I want folks to keep that in mind as I talk about the nitty-gritty of how the law works, really banding together, protecting folks of different faith groups, like the many that we do have here, ultimately strengthens protections for all of us to exist in a pluralistic society that we're trying to aim for in this country. Now, let me talk a little bit about some of the wins. And when I say that, I mean few of the decisions along the way in this case. And to do that, I just want to give a little bit of history, not too much, and I'll leave some room for Q&A at the end. But as you heard from Bridger, in the fall of 2023, that is when the government came in, searched and seized psilocybin and scriptural records from Singularism. A week later, we filed suit against the government requesting emergency relief. Now, that went on, and there was a lot of happenstance between that and the court decisions, but in December 2024, the federal courts, the case had been removed from a state court jurisdiction to a federal court jurisdiction by defendants. A federal court granted a temporary restraining order. And for folks' knowledge, and when you're asking for emergency relief like that, you actually have to demonstrate to the court by putting on almost a trial out of nothing that you are substantially likely to win in the case. And so the court does a quick look at that on a temporary restraining order basis. And on that quick look, the judge did find that we were substantially likely to win the case for singularism. Now, the court took more hearings and more evidence and took on a larger set of considerations. And in February 2025, the court issued what's called a preliminary injunction. And for those that are unfamiliar, a preliminary injunction is basically a protection while a case is ongoing. And so in this case, the court ordered that the psilocybin mushrooms be returned, the records be returned, anything else that was seized be returned, and that the defendants not interfere with singularism's religious practices during the pendency of the rest of the case. And that's pretty remarkable. That decision is a really important one to read if you haven't read it, and happy to provide that to those that don't. And hopefully if we'll have time later, I'll give you a little glimpse of some of the language from that decision. But really important protections for singularism, of course. The government could have appealed those decisions. It chose not to for whatever reason. But months later, in August of 2025, so just a few months ago, the federal court issued another decision on two separate motions contained in the same document. The first was a denial of the government's motions to dismiss the case on all grounds. And the practical effect of that is that singularism's claims all remain live in the lawsuit, all of their free exercise claims, and also all of their search and seizure claims. That decision also contained a decision on singularism's motion for an anti-suit injunction. And that's a very technical legal term, but practically what it means is an order from the federal court judge telling the state court judge in the criminal case that Bridger mentioned was brought personally against him after the TRO was issued, telling that state court to stop the case, prohibit the case. And a few weeks after that was issued, the criminal claims against Bridger were dismissed without prejudice, which is an exciting development, of course, for Bridger. So those are the most recent developments in terms of what in fact has happened. And I'll try to talk a little bit about the meat and what that is for the next few minutes. But as John has previewed, the next big flashpoint in this case is appeal. Defendants have appealed that latest decision, the one that involves that motion to dismiss and that anti-suit injunction, to the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. And for those that are interested, whether in support or neutrally in weighing in on that case on an amicus basis, the time to do that is very likely to be at or around December 17th. So that's coming up in about 2 months. Now, I just want to back up a little bit more and just focus on what is actually happening in this case. What are the claims that the court is processing? What is being evaluated? And I'm just going to talk about the First Amendment or the religious liberty claims today. There are some others about search and seizure, but if you have questions about that, I can speak to those later. But there are three different versions of religious liberty claims that are being brought in this case. The first is a First Amendment to the US Constitution claim. The second is a Utah Constitution claim, very similar to the First Amendment. And the last is a Utah Religious Freedom Restoration Act claim. And you might ask, why bring all those things? And the reason is they differ in how they apply. The First Amendment, as many of you may know, has fairly weak protections actually for religious liberties because of a decision from the United States Supreme Court in the early 90s called the Smith case. Now, there's been a lot of reaction to that, and states and the federal government has taken different action. But if you're just using the First Amendment, typically, the religious claimants are not likely to win the case because of how the burdens shake down. Now, there are exceptions to that, and singularism has availed itself of one of those exceptions to get more of a strict scrutiny framework established on the government. The other bit is the Utah Constitution. It's up in the air in some respect whether the Utah Constitution protects religious liberty in the very same way or is more protective of religious liberty than the First Amendment. The Utah Supreme Court just hasn't decided that issue yet, but that's still an issue in this case. And then last, and probably most importantly, in 2024, Utah passed a state-level version of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And as the name of that act implies, that restored protections for religious liberty back to like a pre-1990-ish interpretation of the First Amendment. And that allows folks like Singularism to bring claims against government officials for the damages and the harms that have been done to them, and hope to obtain, relief or at least orders to stop conduct. Now, I'm happy to go into those in more detail about what the court actually decided, but in very short, with the last 2 minutes I have here, the court came out very favorably in all those claims across those 3 different decisions I talked about earlier, in saying that the government had not proven its burden. It could not show compelling enough reasons that were so compelling that it needed to stop Singularism's religious practice. And even if it had been able to show really compelling reasons like public safety or public health or preventing the distribution of unlawful drugs to the public, even if it had been able to show those, it couldn't show that the government was using the least restrictive means possible to accomplish those interests. So if there are any other ways to burden religious freedom less and still achieve those interests, the government should have used those. And the judge found that there were, in fact, at least 2 different ways. The principal way being a secular exemption for psilocybin usage and treatment in 2 of Utah's hospital systems, and the other being a religious exemption from the Utah Controlled Substance Act for Native American religious usage of peyote. So that's the broad scope, just in a few minutes. I will hold for later maybe a quote from one of the decisions that I think will be of interest for people, and then we can talk about perhaps what sorts of issues would be on appeal, what the concerns might be, and what avenues there might be for folks to weigh in on an amicus basis.
And just to be clear too, Tanner, in addition to the 15 minutes of Q&A, we also have 10 separate minutes just for you and Bridger at the end. So,
perfect.
So we'll do more later. Thank you, Tanner. I thought that was an incredibly good job of translating some extremely esoteric issues about, younger abstention and, the state RFRA versus the federal and all that stuff. So thanks so much. And by the way, so I don't forget to say it, if anybody has some actual paying work in Utah in employment or appellate litigation or even religious rights, make sure to think of Tanner, because he's a good man and he's put an awful lot into this case. So we'll be back to you, Tanner and Bridger, later. Right now, I want to introduce you to a really pretty unusual person in all the best senses of the word, Gordon. I met Gordon in the process last year of finding experts for a couple of clients who, wanted to at least know what the list looked like for, the best experts in the country or in the world who know about the definition of religion, what is and is not a legitimate religion, to the extent we can even say that, but we'll talk more about existential humility. And B, somebody I thought would play well with a jury, because I, having been a trial lawyer most of my life, having a big brain doesn't necessarily help you in some of these, say, more so-called conservative parts of the country. And the fact that in addition to all the other stuff you'll see that Gordon's done by clicking his bio there, he also is an ordained Methodist minister who goes to church every Sunday, as near as I can tell. I've certainly talked to him a few times when he was on the way or getting home. Plus, Gordon still, even at in fairly advanced part of his career, is out helping little churches all over the world. So with that, Gordon, take it away.
Thanks, John. It's good to be here and talking with you concerning these questions. I might say that I'm a historian. I've been at it for 50 years now. And during that time, I is my task the idea of learning about all of the different varieties of American religion, monitoring the growth of pluralism. We now have, for example, 1,500 different Christian denominations in the U.S., and almost that many more other than Christian groups here. And I do a thing called the Encyclopedia of American Religions, in which we report on the present state of all of the different groups in America. And those have included, almost from the beginning, what today we're calling entheogenic groups. I grew up during my college years at the time when the Leary and the psychedelic issues were being raised. Remember the passing of the Controlled Substances Act and the negative court cases that came about, different groups trying to gain an exception to the Controlled Substances Act for themselves. And then more recently, as we did the 9th edition of the encyclopedia. And at that point, as we were doing it, became aware that there was a growing number of entheogenic churches. After we put the 9th edition to bed, sent it off to the publisher, started looking around for other groups. At that time, we were focused on cannabis, but we did that. And then about a year and a half ago, I met Mira and Alex in Atlanta, and I want to say thank you to them. They were very important in calling my attention to the fact that there really had been an explosion of interest in entheogenic groups. And growing out of my meeting with them, I put together a project to try to find out just how big this explosion had been. So we set out to conduct a survey of all of the entheogenic groups in America and find out how much they were impacting religious life now. What we found out was that there were about 325 different new religious movements built around the use of one form or another of an entheogenic substance. The largest of these by far is the Native American Church, which claims around 300,000 members at this point. It's certainly the oldest of the groups functioning in the U.S., having been formed as a corporation in 1917, which pulled together a number of smaller, more informal peyote users into a formal organization that could combine their efforts to fight for their place in the American religious landscape. The next to arrive were the Rastafarians, who came in the middle of the century from Jamaica. They became a very important part of the community, very interesting part of it, very colorful part. Also very hard to study part because of the way that they meet. Then it's after RIFRA is passed, other groups begin to appear. Most notably, the ayahuasca groups from Brazil came in. I remember when they first showed up in the 1990s, and nobody knew who they were, and they were floating around and claiming to be using ayahuasca, and we were wondering what it was all about, but nobody had heard of ayahuasca, so it wasn't on anybody's radar. But very soon it got added to the Schedule 1 drugs, and they settled in for a fight, which finally resulted in their getting the same kind of exceptions that the Native American Church had had. And then there were all of the groups using cannabis and psilocybin that began after the legalization in Washington and started the trend toward legalization that we see today. In monitoring these groups, what we found was some very, very interesting statistics. There are about 500,000 people associated with one form or another of the entheogenic churches at this point. As I said, 300,000 of those 500,000, that is 3/5 of them, belong to one of the three large Native American churches. Most of them are with the Native American Church of North America, but there are two smaller groups that also come into that. One church, the Church of Ambrosia, the church that brought John and I together, claims to have 100,000 members. And apart from those two groups, all of the other groups are relatively small. Most of them less than 100 members, few of them in 200 or 300 members. So when we think about the whole entheogenic community, we're talking about a huge North American, Native American church, the Church of Ambrosia, and everybody else. And so most of the churches are quite small and quite fragile. When we started looking at how are these groups fitting into the larger religious community in a country of 330 plus million people, we're talking about a relatively small group. We have 2 million Buddhists, 2 million Hindus, 3 or 4 million Muslims, but only 500,000 members of the entheogenic church. And the Native American church bought its exceptionalism by limiting its membership to Native Americans. That contributes to the fact that these groups are invisible upon the religious landscape. As we drive around our communities, we do not see the first entheogenic church of New York with a big sign inviting you in. These churches survive on the internet and on social media, and as such, their existence is very fragile. They can go in and out of existence very, very quickly. But they do seem at this point in time to be growing and growing spectacularly. There's been a long religious history of the legal side of the question that goes back to 1917 and the formation of the Native American Church, the lengthy battle they had to establish their place in the community. And the fight over cannabis that begins with Washington in 2012 with the legalization of cannabis, and that's still, of course, an ongoing fight, but seemed to be over the hump. And then we come to the psilocybin question, of course, the ayahuasca question in the 2000s. The ayahuasca people win the same rights that the Native Americans do. And we come now to the singularity case, which is sort of the first case of an ongoing battle that is going to be continuing. This is a case, lower court ruling. It's going to be tested on appeal, and there's going to be other cases that will have to be fought out in other states before we get to the question of is psilocybin going to become as acceptable, say, as this is today, and where we are continually seeing the use of cannabis expanding and thus the rights of cannabis using churches. Psilocybin will be the question for the next generation, certainly the next decade, over the rights of what is happening. But this,
hey, Gordon?
Yes.
If I could real quick, one thing I want to do is introduce Alyssa and Daniel, who are going to take over the cutting people off part here, so I don't have to do it. But just real quick, because we are down to 3 minutes, I know you've been a witness for a lot of different churches, and I know that part of what you do, because I've worked with you, is to help poke some holes that then we can fill before we get to court. Would you, from a purely religious perspective, do you see any anomalies here with singularism that worry you, if you were going to be an expert witness here?
No, the main one is explaining to the court the kind of religion that singularism represents, namely in the esoteric and more Eastern-based religions, you don't start the truth as you do within the major Western religions, but you start with the quest of truth. It's not that you have answered the three great religious questions of where did we come from, why are we here, and where are we going, but that you focus the question and focus a technique for getting the answer and exploring what after, so that the revelation of truth is not the beginning of wisdom, it is the culmination of wisdom. You have to explain to that, because as in the Myers decision, for example, setting the criteria of what is a religion purely based on Western Christianity and Judaism, so that the characteristics are the characteristics of the 1500 Christian sect groups. That's the main problem that you have in the court is doing that. But when you say that it's not answering those questions, it's the search for those questions, and then that search becomes the major content of your religious gatherings.
Excellent. That's very and very consistent with what Bridger was saying earlier. So, Gordon, we're down to 1 minute. I know you're going to stick around and help us answer some hard questions later. Am I right on that?
I am.
Okay. Thanks so much, Gordon. What a pleasure it's been to work with you and get to meet all kinds of interesting people together. And just can't believe the amount of work you've done, not just for us, but for the world of religious rights generally, and, you know, the work you do at Baylor and elsewhere. Thank you so much.
Hey, watch out, my head's growing here. You know?
I'm sure you've had it hit a few times too. So
yeah.
Some of this pretty controversial stuff.
All right.
All right. Thanks so much, Gordon. Really appreciate it. We're going to move now. You've probably heard 2 or 3 times this reference to existential humility. I think as Entheist practitioners, we like that a lot. As lawyers, I think some of us worry a little bit about it, and that to some extent is going to be where Jay is going to talk to us a little bit about that and some other key points. But Jeff Bro is a guy I've gotten to know in this work at Harvard, and you know, he loves to go down a lot of rabbit holes. He's got an extensive knowledge of comparative religions and all kinds of esoteric sources that occasionally he shares with us. He's also done a fascinating, both a PowerPoint deck and some other collateral. If you ever get to Boston, there's like a walking tour of all the places in and around the Harvard campus where Entheism is, you know, gained some of its strength, starting with Ram Dass and Timothy Leary, et cetera, and the Good Friday experiment, which is just about a mile away from the campus there. So anyway, Jeff, I won't go on and embarrass you any further. So take it away for us, would you?
Perfect. Thank you, John. Yes, sufficiently embarrassed, but also very grateful to be here and to be invited to speak about singularism and existential humility. As John mentioned, I am one of the program leads at Harvard Divinity School Center for the Study of World Religions and oversee the Psychedelics and Religion program here. And part of what I do in that role is ethnographic research with new psychedelic churches, or what I call novel psychedelic spiritual communities, to avoid some of the Christian associations with church. And as Gordon was stating, the entheogenic or psychedelic church world it's relatively small. I mean, 500,000 people is not nothing. But within that 500,000 folks who are engaging in these practices, like Gordon mentioned, most of them are practicing in traditions that have either are coming directly out of an indigenous lineage or have ties to indigenous spiritual practices or major world religions. So syncretic traditions like the Native American Church or the Santo Daime or União de Vegetal. The churches that I study, the traditions that I study are, the reason that I call them novel psychedelic spiritual communities is because they are groups that are forming outside of these indigenous plant medicine traditions and outside of major world religions. So they are new religious movements that don't have the same grounds of legitimacy or the same grounds of practice in existing traditions. And by legitimacy, I mean legitimacy in the courts, particularly. They're going to have a harder time, I think, when they're making these cases. And Singularism is an example of one of these novel psychedelic churches. And what I'm speaking about here is one of the things that really stood out to me in this case and in how the judge is approaching their religious tradition. And it's this idea of what Judge Parrish, the judge in the 10th Circuit, called existential humility in her preliminary injunction in February. Existential humility, it's a term coming out of actually an article from 2023, a psychologist. We might also call it, rather than existential humility, we might call it epistemological humility, intellectual humility. I think it's also tied to things like a non-dogmatic approach, a pluralistic approach to religion, in which the tradition is not positioning itself, the religion is not positioning itself as the sole arbiter of knowledge about life's big questions, but is rather welcoming people who have many different understandings of the nature of reality or answers to metaphysical questions. There was a quote that Bridger gave in his testimony to the courts where he said, quote, he said, in his view, quote, rigid dogma closes people off from spirituality and spiritual connection. And end of that quote. He sees what Singularism is doing is not trying to provide, in his words, rigid dogma that is giving participants, voyagers in these ceremonies, an answer to what God is supposed to be, to what the experience is supposed to look like, but is in fact sort of stepping back and allowing people to have their own experience and their own understanding of what these existential questions, what the meaning of life is, what the nature of God is, what the nature of reality is. And in Judge Parrish's ruling, she found this to actually be an important part of Singularism's religion and a valid expression of religion, which was the Utah government arguing against Singularism in this case was saying that the fact that they were unwilling to give concrete answers to life's big questions was evidence that they were failing the Myers test requirement for comprehensiveness of beliefs. But what Judge Parrish said was that it would, quote, be inappropriate to hold Singularism's existential humility against it, especially since, she goes on to say, existential humility is important for enabling and supporting the smooth functioning of a pluralistic society like ours. And so what I think is interesting here are a couple of things. One is Judge Parrish's reframing of Singularism's pluralism, their desire to locate religious knowledge in the individual rather than in the hierarchy. She reframed this as a positive thing and as a sign of humility, not as a sign of a lack of beliefs, but as a sign that their beliefs are differently located. The loci of truth is coming from the individual and their experience during a psilocybin voyage. I think that is an interesting way of thinking about these traditions because it is so present in many of the psychedelic churches that I work with. There is a desire to not force upon members a particular understanding of the divine. There's a desire to allow people who are coming in with many different religious or non-religious commitments and beliefs and understandings into the fold and to be part of that, to be part of the church, and not to say that we all have to see the world in the same way. So I think it's an important thing that singularism is picking up on, that is true of many psychedelic churches, new psychedelic churches. It's also interesting that the article that coined the term existential humility itself was arguing that psychedelics may be a way of increasing existential humility. So at least in Jeffrey Green's article, there's a case that maybe this is something that psychedelics have the ability to provoke in people. And in that way, these churches may be seen as actually a natural response to how psychedelics can and might be used and what they might be occasioning in their members. So very much in alignment with the religious practice. The religious beliefs seem to be following in some way from the religious practice, the entheogenic practices. The other thing that I think is very interesting and important to note here about Judge Parrish's injunction is what I mentioned at the end, which is her statement that existential humility is important for enabling and supporting the smooth functioning of a pluralistic society like ours. She's not simply saying in the injunction that this is worthy of being considered religious belief. She's actually saying it is a valuable belief to hold for our society, for the modern United States. And I think that one of the concerns that I had looking through the court documents about the way that the government was pushing singularism and challenging their religious beliefs were their pushing of Bridger to be a prophet. As he told me in an interview that we did, he felt like they wanted him to be a prophet alone. And part of the reason that the Utah government wanted that was because it's one of the things that's mentioned in Myers. It's one of the accoutrements of religion in the fifth part of the Myers test, which they're using, is that religions have a prophet. Of course, we know that not all things we call religion have prophets, but given that is something that the government is saying is a sign of religion, they were pushing the state government in Provo in Utah was pushing singularism and Bridger to say, okay, I am the prophet, because that would be evidence of a sincere religion. I think that is potentially quite a risky thing to be asking any religion to do, but especially religions that are using psychedelics. And one of the things that with singularism and their statements of belief is this desire not to be cult-like. And I think that one can easily see the way in which requiring a religious leader to have all of the answers, to be the sole prophet, and to have the sole existential or epistemic authority within the community could actually lead to power imbalances and behavior in a religious community that we actually might be concerned about. And so I think it is what Judge Parrish is identifying here is that there is a way that the government's requirements for religious sincerity may actually lead to religious outcomes that are not what we as a society would encourage. So all of that was really in the mix in how the judge is thinking about existential humility, how singularism is thinking about it, and taking a step back and thinking about this from a religious studies perspective. I think it's raising very interesting and important questions about how do we understand and conceptualize religion in the 21st century. I'm thinking here especially of this dichotomy that is often thrown around between religion and spirituality. And when people that I'm interviewing are defining those two terms, the most common definition that's given is that religion is hierarchical, it is dogmatic, it's coming with structures and rules and ways that one must behave in order to be a good person. And spirituality, on the other hand, is much more often understood as a felt experience, a lived experience. It's located within the individual, and how they relate to and understand and move through their relationship with the divine or with these existential questions. Now, in the law, spirituality is not protected. And yet, for many of the people that I talk to, and for many of the people who are members of these novel psychedelic churches, something akin to spirituality is actually what they are looking for in their religious practice. They are looking for the ability to not to be in community, but also to be true to, they might use the word intuition, to their own autonomy, to their agency, and see a lot of harm that religion has caused in their own life or in the life of their peers. And so I think we need to think more thoughtfully about what are the ways in which our religious structures need to be able to accommodate and update and expand to hold this understanding of spirituality that many Americans, 20+% of Americans identify as spiritual but not religious now. And so we have this sort of groundswell of people who are redefining religion in this way. And yet the courts on the whole seem not to privilege or seem to be concerned about spirituality versus religion. And I think what singularism and this emphasis on existential humility is pushing all of us, but especially pushing the courts to think about these questions in a more nuanced way. What are the ways that religion can look more spiritual, using the definition I provided? And what are the ways that spirituality might look religious or might be thought of as a religion? And the last thing I'll end with is this is not new. This approach to religion is actually deeply American in a lot of ways. There's a book by a scholar of religion, Lee Schmidt, looking at the book's titled American Spirituality. And he's really looking at the currents of religiosity in the United States from the 1800s, and this move towards experiential religion, religion that respects individuals' autonomy. Emerson, in his Divinity School address here at Harvard Divinity School, very much coming out of a Christian tradition, but emphasizing that one should acquaint thyself at first hand with deity. These are not trends that are outside of what we might think of as religion. Mystical branches of Protestantism, etc. And yet when they come into contact with a practice that is illegal, with psychedelics, they are often being held against traditions like singularism, despite their long history in American religiosity.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Jeff. One question I'll want to ask you later when we're in the Q&A is whether there's any limit at all to this existential humility idea, because one of the issues hopefully Jay's going to get into too is it's mostly just us chickens talking to each other here, right? And a lot of us sort of agreed with each other before we started. So with that, I'm going to introduce Jay. Thank you, Jeff. I won't even try to summarize Jay's bio. I wish it were mine. Has done a lot of very interesting things, and I think you're going to experience that right now. Thank you, Jay.
Thanks, John. I appreciate that succinct and yet expansive introduction. So a framing question in my section, and I'm not seeing my video, but hopefully you are, is whether singularism changed the case, the Jensen versus Utah County changed the law. And the answer I would say is, for now, it certainly expanded it. I think the main point I'd like to get across is a fundamental misalignment between the law as written and actual entheogenic practice, and arguably just as 21st century American religious practice or spiritual practice in general. That is the real issue here. The gap between, and I'm really happy to follow Jeff. I agree with all of those points that he just made. There's a gap between what both scholars and practitioners would say on the one hand, and what judges generally say on the other. The First Amendment protects the practice of religion, not of spirituality. That is in the definition. We may live in a country that just does not actually have a legal regime yet in place to protect the way that many, not most yet, but many Americans actually do practice their religion/spirituality. Judge Parrish's opinion, I think, is remarkable because the gap is so much smaller than in most cases. But I would say that that's a vulnerability when we move to the 10th Circuit. Basically, in my reading of the case, it would significantly limit Myers if upheld at the 10th Circuit. And I'd like to give 4 specific examples of that. Things that I think Judge Parrish got right about singularism and about religious practice, but there could be liabilities because they're so different from what the state of the law was before this case was decided. So the first is just the novelty of singularism as an entheogenic case, right? So there has not been a case where a new religion with no indigenous link has been given a religious exemption to the Controlled Substances Act for the use of psychedelics. If this were to stand, surely 100 entheist churches would also qualify. We may think that's a good thing, but that would definitely be a new thing, right? And I think it's important to think about what the guardrails would be around some of the concerns which appear over and over again in these cases: commercialization, sincerity, guarding the sacrament from diversion, which means the drugs go to somebody else, the safety of practitioners. These are things which courts have addressed many times in previous psychedelic cases, but this would be, I think, a sea change in terms of how many parties could conceivably qualify for exemptions. There could just be a lot more permitted psychedelic use. That may be the result we want. I'm just pointing out that it's a new result. And lawyers love to worry about slippery slopes, and I'll get to those in just a moment. Right? So the fact that singularism is novel and recently founded is not fatal. Right, but it does, the lack of the historical roots gives the government a certain kind of tactical advantage in these arguments. And I think, I won't go through all of the Myers test factors, which I think many on this call might know about, but it is notable how many are not present in the case of singularism. Again, Myers didn't say that you have to check every single box, but John makes a living by going around writing Bibles for psychedelic churches. And this case would put him out of business, right? Because it makes it clear that you don't actually need to tick each of these boxes in order to be recognized for a religious exemption. Whether it's the consistent doctrine, whether it is having a prophet or one spiritual leader, and I agree exactly with what Jeff said. And one thing that Jeff's also done in some of his research is note how the law has actually shaped some of the ways that psychedelic churches operate. Here, it's interesting, right? It's just specifically to avoid being a cult with the cult leader that many psychedelic churches operate a little bit like singularism does, whether it's existential humility or whether it's, I would say, organizational humility, right? That's a deliberate choice to go against the kind of pitfalls that we've seen in spiritual communities in the past. So again, maybe the Myers factors, I think the Myers factors are largely inadequate to describe religion and spirituality as actually practiced. I'm just pointing out that could actually be a legal liability. I would say, for me, I think the existential humility or epistemic humility is one of the issues. I think a much larger one was in Bridger's PowerPoint or the presentation. Is something that sits at an overlap between religion and philosophy a religion under RFRA, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and the First Amendment. I'm not asking whether it's good, and it is this kind of, I'm just asking whether it's actually covered. There is a kind of catch-22, I think, that's presented to all psychedelic churches or novel psychedelic spiritual communities. On the one hand, you're told you have to be sincere. On the other hand, you have to shape your religious belief to fit these antiquated legal doctrines. Well, which is it? Am I being truthful the way that Bridger was in his presentation, telling you, well, we sit at the junction of religion and philosophy? Well, or do you have to sort of gussy it up to make it look more religious and less philosophical in order to gain legal recognition? The fault here, I don't think, lies with singularism. The fault lies with about, at this point, 35 years of court cases, which do take a very Christian/Judeo-Christian model and kind of stamp it where it doesn't necessarily belong. This is a gap between the sociological reality of religion in America and the legal reality of religion in court cases. So that's just what's new here. A second area of, I would say, innovation, but also liability, has to do with sincerity versus commercialization. So it is the case that money changes hands in singularism, and in as many other cases. You know, it's interesting reading over the opinions in the case. It looks to me like the government really made a mistake, basically arguing that singularism was just a sham and it was a cover so that Bridger could be a drug dealer. This is ludicrous, right? It's facially ridiculous. And if you want to be a drug dealer, there are a lot easier ways to do it than opening up a website, for God's sake, and telling people to come and get their drugs. That's not a good way to be a drug dealer. But I think it does reflect the really blinkered way in which law enforcement often looks at these cases. Oh, you're just doing this this is just a scam so that you can sell drugs. That's ridiculous. And I think it may have been a tactical mistake on the part of the government. It's part of what the judge found ludicrous. And yet, when you look at, if you think about the 10th Circuit, the record does suggest that there's evidence that, again, money is changing hands. You know, there's something that may look like marketing, and the fees for service might be considered high in some ways. So you think again about, like, don't think necessarily about singularism and Bridger, but again, think like a lawyer worrying about the slippery slope. So what would we do for churches or organizations that really are sham churches? And these exist as well, right? So you go in parts of San Francisco to join a church and you sign your name on dotted line, now you're a member, and then you can get your psychedelics. That maybe that should be protected under an expansive understanding of religious freedom, but it certainly would trouble, I would say, most judges looking at a case like that. So how do we distinguish a case like this from a hypothetical case like that? And it's actually, I think, really an open question how that gets resolved the next time this case is heard. Third, and I would say very similarly, and I'll just spend a moment on it, is as Bridger said, there's an overlap here between therapy and mental health and religion. In previous cases, that has been seen as a negative. And when I first heard about this case, I thought, oh gosh, these guys are in trouble because the guy running it is acting half like a therapist and half like a church leader. And that's something that judges look askance at. Because again, RFRA therapy is great, but RFRA and the First Amendment don't protect it, right? That's not something that gets you an exemption from the Controlled Substance Act. Interestingly, had I been arguing this case for the government, which thank God I will never do in a million years, I might actually make more of some of these other claims that this isn't really a religion. This is something around mental health. It's great. We like you, singularism. We like you, Bridger, but you're not protected by RFRA. Instead, they tried to paint Bridger out as a drug dealer, which just, again, seems like a really poor choice of tactics for me. So fourth and finally, it hasn't been mentioned yet by the presenters, I do want us to think about the other slippery slope, that if this counts as a religion, we should think about, I don't know, bad actors or more controversial actors who could also create bogus religions to do things like stockpile weapons or discriminate against people. Imagine a hypothetical new religion that's created that has racist beliefs that say that requires them to exclude people of color from their community, and they create a whites-only town, such as is actually happening in a town happening right now in America. So I want to suggest, the unfortunate reality is that in the last 15 to 20 years, the Supreme Court has expanded the ambit of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act on the federal level, and that's also happened on state levels, to include third-party harms. The clearest and best answer to this slippery slope would be to say, well, singularism isn't hurting anybody, but the hypothetical I just said is hurting somebody. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court has completely erased that distinction in Hobby Lobby, in Fulton versus Philadelphia, and also I would say in the Masterpiece Cake Shop case, where third-party harm is not treated as significantly different from any other religious exercise. So the fact that my religion causes you to lose your rights, whether it's access to contraception or, in my case, my right to have a cake baker bake my same-sex wedding cake, has been deemed legally irrelevant by the Supreme Court. And so I think there is actually a slippery slope concern here, that if singularism wins its recognition, how does a court draw a distinction between this case and another case in which a novel religious community, non-psychedelic, is created that seriously abridges the rights and dignity of other people? Fortunately, it's not within my remit here to predict what the 10th Circuit will do, But it will be interesting to see if the government kind of adjusts some of its arguments away from painting Bridger out to be a drug dealer toward some of the more, I would say, serious concerns around how to distinguish between sham and real religious organizations, how to distinguish between religious or protected religious practices that don't hurt anybody else and those that do, and how to draw the line around what religion might actually be. I admit, and I've debated whether or not to say this with the lawyer actually on the call, but I admit to a certain skepticism around whether the 10th Circuit will expand RFRA jurisprudence in such a dramatic way, whether for my reasons that I've outlined or others. The last thing I'll say, since I'll cede 2 of my minutes, John, to the next speaker, which is always a fun thing to do. I think it is interesting to view this case in light of some of the unique sets of circumstances around it. I think the LDS context in Utah and the post-LDS, the ex-Mormon context, which is familiar in a Utah context, may not be familiar in some other ones. That people are going on spiritual journeys all the time. They're integrating, again, specific to Utah, they're integrating their faith with other traditions. They're moving and exploring. And this is a pattern that looks really familiar and looks like a very sincere religious practice. And I think that's for the best, right? I think that's a good development. I'm just, again, saying that it's new. On the flip side, while some on the more liberal side of the political spectrum might worry about expanding religious freedom jurisprudence to include all kinds of mainstream Christian actors who want to discriminate against people like me, that may actually count towards it at the 10th Circuit. It may be that the 10th Circuit is very friendly. Certainly the Supreme Court is very friendly right now to expanding religious freedom jurisprudence. And it'll be a really interesting question. I've talked about this with a lot of attorneys and law professors. Which commitment is going to be predominant? The commitment to a certain kind of usually conservative content legal result, or the commitment toward protecting religious freedom, including for entheogenic churches such as Singularism. No way to predict what will happen with that. And that is why this will be a really interesting case to follow in the months to come.
Jay, you do have 1 more minute, so let me ask you a question. What do you think? You said you've talked to all these professors. Is there any kind of a majority view or a view that you...
No, I think it's really hard to call, right? I think it would actually be easier to predict at the Supreme Court level than at the 10th Circuit level. You know, again, for non-lawyers, especially on the call, you know, Myers is not a Supreme Court case, right? So it's not that the 10th Circuit has to be bound by it. And it can set aside half of those criteria or say that they're not important. But I think I think there's a lot of factors on both sides. I do think prudentially worrying about those slippery slope cases that I mentioned, and just seeing this as an expansion of what's been done so far gives me a little bit of pause.
Yeah, and it's you know, it's interesting too. One of the biggest case, obviously, on the definition of religion is Myers, 10th Circuit case, and then we have Quaintance about the proof of sincerity, also a 10th Circuit case written by Justice Gorsuch, who's now on the U.S. Supreme Court, and both those cases came out the wrong way for those of us in the Entheist movement.
Right,
so,
right.
Thanks, Jay.
Well, this case is, you know, Myers was a tough case. I mean, first of all, the first rule in psychedelics law is cannabis always loses, right? Because that's just how it is. And this did not, in Myers, the singularism is much more of what I would call a clearly facially sincere religion than was at issue in Myers. And I think actually the government's bizarre choice of tactics maybe is a response to that. They had to somehow fall back on the one thing they always say, that this is not sincere, that it's a sham to do drugs. And what I'm saying is this clearly is sincere, at least on my read of it. Since singularism clearly is sincere, it's just a question actually of whether it's a quote unquote religion as courts have understood it.
Thanks, Jay. And by the way, since he won't say it, sign up for Jay's Substack. It's one of the few I read every week. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague now, Daniel Shortt, who's going to lead us through 15 minutes of questions. And we've got a bunch of them. They're good questions. Some of them are very hard questions. So I'm going to hand it over to you now, Daniel. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, John. And thank you to all of our speakers. especially want to thank everyone for moving this along, so timely. I'll try to do the same here and get right to the questions. Little background, my name's Daniel Shortt. I'm one of the founding attorneys here at Salzhauer Shortt. Our law firm focuses on all kinds of different plant issues, lots of cannabis work, a growing amount of work in these other psychoactive plants. So one of kind of two of the questions that we have up here are related. And Tanner, I think this one is for you. And I also want to just say as well that, to the extent, only answer these questions to the extent that you're comfortable. Obviously, this is an ongoing matter. And, if you want to just kind of move along, we can. But I think one of the issues that's come up, mentioned by a number of our speakers, is this idea of the tension between sort of the outward facing religious use with singularism, and then also this sort of treatment wellness center. I know, a lot of this is founded in therapy. It's open. We also have, the Soul Quest case where the kind of public facing wellness center analysis seemed to hurt that case. So I was just wondering, as you anticipate sort of the next stage here, what you think about that and sort of how that's reflected in the current record, and any steps you're taking to kind of shore that up. And I also want to mention that we have a number of folks who want to help with the briefing, so keep that in mind as well.
Well, that's fantastic. And of course, appreciate the support significantly. And I do want to say I'm now like in the dark. I have automatic blinds, so we'll see if, I come to light here in a minute. But I appreciate that question about the tension between kind of what some might seem to see as the outward-facing religious use in singularism's case, and like a more inward, treatment center therapy type approach. And there are a lot of different issues here. Obviously, I can't comment on, all the strategy and all the pieces of the ongoing case. But I think that is a tension that has been identified and well discussed. And I think Jay did a great job of talking about that as well. I also think there's some tension with those concepts, even in some of the Supreme Court decisions. So, for example, Jay mentioned the Hobby Lobby decision, which was an extension of RFRA protections, religious liberty protections, to an explicitly for-profit company that did have essentially religious founders. And that's interesting. Like, let's just view singularism for a moment as a purely religious business. Even if we were to do that, there may be some paths, including under the Hobby Lobby, for some sorts of protections there. Now, you could see that a lot of folks would be less hesitant to grant protections in the context of controlled substance usage, where there's money involved and it's a business, as opposed to a craft store in Hobby Lobby, even though there are significant issues there at play as well, with women's contraceptive issues and women's health issues. But that is a tension that I think will continue to be present in this case. However, I do think it's, credit to Bridger and Singularism in being very transparent about what their beliefs are, that their religious conception of what the world is doesn't stop at the line that has been arbitrarily opposed by some, at the line of science or at the line of therapy or at the line of philosophy, right? It really bleeds into or encompasses and embraces those aspects. And it's a question of whether, bleeding across those lines and not fitting into like a Myers-esque mold will be a benefit or a liability at the appellate level.
Got it. Thank you for that. This is a question that I'll just admit is from me. I've learned quite a bit on this, and I think this, other panelists feel free to join in, because another issue, and I think it's related to this, Tanner, and this is more abstract, so maybe you can comment on this.
Sure.
A few years ago, I went to Jamaica for a conference, and this is right around the time that Jamaica was legalizing recreational cannabis. And one thing that I found very notable there was that they actually break down their legal markets, and this may have changed, but at the time, into sort of three distinct markets. You have medical, you have recreational, and then you have sacramental use. We've seen sort of the momentum shift in terms of legalizing psilocybin or other substances. So I'm wondering, and other folks feel free to jump in here, whether or not say the legalization of psilocybin for a more expanded medical use or recreational use would essentially help or hurt these types of arguments. I think earlier, I believe it was maybe Jay who said cannabis always loses. Just wondering, will we see a shift if there is legalization in these non-sacramental uses?
I certainly think it will have an impact. And my current perspective is that it's to the benefit of entheogenic religious practice in these sorts of cases. And just as an example for Utah, and if we haven't mentioned this already, Utah's legislature basically commissioned a study into psilocybin, and it went on for a year or two. They looked at it and they made us some reports. They have a long report and all very positive as to the usages, even in a secular context. And recommended essentially that when the FDA moves along with its process, Utah will too. Now, when that came out, just days or months later after that, Utah's governor essentially vetoed a bill, or publicly said it wasn't going to go for it, and said we're not going to experiment on Utahns. Strikingly, though, in the very next legislative session, we have this very broad bill that passes through the legislature essentially without notice, sponsored by Republicans in the legislature, which adopts this essentially pilot and I would say almost experimentation program and allows 2 hospital systems in Utah to do that. And those sorts of things are happening in different places and for different substances. Utah also has cannabis usage in the medical context now as well, as part of like a citizen referendum effort that occurred. So why do I think those things will impact what's going on in these sorts of religious cases? Is because when you get to discussion about strict scrutiny, there are essentially 2 aspects that the government has to prove, and they have to prove both. And the first one is that they have a compelling government interest in stopping the religious practice of entheogens. And that becomes less and less compelling the more and more the government moves and approves of entheogenic substances in different contexts. And in this context here specifically, like in very broad terms and giving discretion to hospital systems to use psilocybin as they will, essentially on their patients. And then in other contexts, with cannabis, and then we have another context of religious use of peyote, right? All those things go to say, the government, you're not really being sincere with us, the court, right? When you're arguing that these things are so important that no religious group can use them. And the other aspect to that is the second component of strict scrutiny analysis with the courts, which shows that the government must use the least restrictive means possible. And certainly if they have other exemptions where they're permitting secular usages of the same substance in the same state, that seems to undermine that. And that's been part of what Judge Parrish in this case has ruled.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tanner. This next question, I'd like to address it to, I think, Gordon. Jay, you may also want to hop in. We've kind of discussed around these, bad examples or bad actors in this space. I hate to use that term too harshly, but I'm wondering, if you have any examples of sort of, churches or ideas that probably wouldn't make it too far if challenged in court, maybe beyond just the sort of sign on the dotted line and then, you get your substances. But if you have other examples that can come to mind, and feel free to, not name names if you don't want to, but just curious.
Everywhere you go, you've got bad actors that show up. You have churches that were organized by people who wanted to expand their sexual life so that they could become kind of Oriental potentates with a harem and do that under the guise of their religious practices. You have people who do the same for money. Who use religion to raise money so they can siphon off money for themselves. And in this area, you have who are can use a religious group to basically set up a business selling drugs, and while they're providing it for people who may themselves be sincere religious believers. people who are running the church are siphoning off money for themselves out of the process. And that's something you have all the way across the boards. From Roman Catholicism on down, it's just a constant problem. It's the most visible evidence I know of original sin. It will show up everywhere. It's something you just have to deal with.
Got it. Thank you. It looks like we have another one in the chat.
Daniel, you want to is this the therapy question?
Go ahead, John. Please jump
Yeah,
in.
let me summarize that because we've had 2 or 3 of them. I don't mean to offend Tanner or Bridger. I don't think I will, but I can tell you this. When I started this practice just 3 or 4 years ago and up till probably 2 years ago, I would say 99% of regular Entheist lawyers who do it a lot would have told Tanner and Bridger that they were going to lose quickly, definitively, and they did not. And that's why, between being both a psilocybin church, but in many ways even more important, being so obviously and clearly and publicly focused on therapy. I mean, the website is psychedelictherapy.com. You guys have done something that virtually none of us would predict. So tell us, maybe Tanner, maybe you're the guy to start the bidding here, but well, actually, we're kind of bleeding into the next 10 minutes here. So I'll give this one to you, Tanner, and well, we'll make it all work. Go for it, Tanner.
Sure thing. So this is just an interesting feature of this case, right? And certainly I don't go into any sort of religious liberty case thinking it's a slam dunk. The way religious liberty claims, including RFRA claims and First Amendment claims operate, is essentially a balancing test. And that balancing test, if strict scrutiny analysis applied, tends to favor the religious claimant, but it does not always. And there are certainly cases in which, even under strict scrutiny analysis, especially in the controlled substances context, the religious claimant does not win, right? And it is, in some sense, remarkable because of, its precedence that this case was able to do that. But I also do think that Bridger, perhaps, more than other individuals or groups, really poured that time and attention into establishing religious connections to the therapy. And Bridger can speak to this in a moment, but from what I understand about singularism for religious practice, the therapy actually is an extension. It is like a practice of the belief system, right? And you see this present in other religious traditions as well, like Christian-based therapy groups, right? And of course, many of those are not using controlled substances as a method for therapy, but that actually center their therapy practice around a religious belief. And kind of push it through that. And, that's come into conflict in some places in the law with, conversion therapy issues and others. So while I would say, certainly as a matter of religious practice, this case is unprecedented in its result in these sets of facts. But I don't think it's wholly unprecedented in kind of the connection between therapy and religion that does exist in different spaces. For example, my own religious practice, I think we have an arm of the church that actually does family therapy and offers therapy to congregants. And then I believe they even accept, private clients for pay. So just interesting there.
Yeah, I was going to agree with you, Tanner, on that, because I've had this discussion a bunch of times with clients is, yes, they're mostly bad precedents. That's why we're all so excited about what you did. On the other hand, Christian Science is mostly spiritual mind treatments. There are retreats of all sorts connected with Catholic churches and many others. You just mentioned a great example as well. I think the thing that, and I'm curious maybe to hear Jay on this, because I know he's given this quite a bit of thought. There is this old statement, one of the professors at Harvard that I really admired years ago said, there will never be a Nobel Prize in law because it's the only field in which you get points for showing that someone thought of your idea first. So being groundbreaking in these things is hard, and you know that, and it's not going to stop in the 10th Circuit, because this prosecutor seems to be wanting to make their political career on it, from the little bit I've heard from you. So anyway, maybe we should ask Jay next, and then we'll come back to you and give some additional thoughts on that.
I can add a thought too when we're ready about that.
Jay, thanks, Bridger.
Yeah, I would just say this goes way back to the original psychedelic religious, right, which are indigenous peoples. This northern Western distinction between religion and healing just doesn't exist, right? There's a reason why shamans are called curanderos, right, in parts of South America, right? There's not, so the flaw in the legal doctrine, it goes right to the heart and the erasure of indigenous use, right? And one reason, I think probably most on the call know this, why the Native American Church set themselves up the way they did, was to sort of repackage Native American religion, spirituality, healing, whatever the right word would be, in a Christian legible context. And I'm in no way criticizing that, right? That enabled the survival of these practices. But it was that kind of gymnastics, I would say, that had to be done in order to make what was religion legible. So, you could go to thousands of years ago, indigenous people using psychedelic substances, and then a court, might complain, oh, you're mixing therapy and religion.
Got it. Thank you. Jay, I think I have one other question that I'm pulling here that seems to be best to you, but others can jump in. We're looking at the kind of sincere belief in cognitive liberty as a defense. I was just wondering if you could speak to that, in case obviously there's a lot of churches here, this is ongoing legal issue, but anything to think about, in preparation in case a defense had to be made under that.
Yeah, it's right. So I'm very receptive to the notion of cognitive liberty as a grounding principle in the law, but I don't wear the black robes. I think the challenge with cognitive liberty as a religious belief is that it's indistinguishable from believing in cognitive liberty as an intellectual or ideological or philosophical belief. So I think it's really, if you look at some of the past cases, not in psychedelics, but in general, where there's conscientious objectors get a good deal, right? Because there's a religious belief that's also a political or an ideological belief. And so that's actually recognized. But a lot of the times where there's a religion that says it has a particular philosophical view, I wouldn't want, as an advocate, trying to serve the needs of my client, I'm not sure I would want to make that the center of, because I think it depends. Maybe the 10th Circuit just overturns the Myers factors in this case, and then Tanner's the hero, right, of this area of law, and we get a more capacious understanding of what really makes a religion, and cognitive liberty as a tenet, not the only tenet, I would say, but a tenet of a sincere religious practice. That's just descriptively true. Right, as the folks on this call have said, right, that's reality, whether it's legal reality or not, that's the truth. And it would be nice if legal reality actually tracked what religious people say they believe. But I would be nervous about centering that in a claim just as a matter of strategy.
Got it. Thank you. So now, we've reached the section here where we wanted to give some more time to Bridger and Tanner. Bridger, I believe before we kind of went into this last question, there was something you wanted to say. So, feel free to follow up on that now.
Well, I suppose I do want to say, yes, these criticisms are welcome, and also, or the critique is welcome. And the arguments are, I think, valid, and some would land on one side and some on another. I totally acknowledge that. I think I want to go back to why we won on the therapy part. And there is a good reason for that she addressed in her preliminary injunctions. And that is that when I was a therapist and a clinician, and this is before I knew how much great research was coming out from all of these notable institutions, and a little bit before, but I let my therapy license expire deliberately. And then I wrote the Department of Professional Licensing. And I said in advance, I have read the Mental Health Therapy Practice Act very well. And there is an exemption in it that says, you know, there are different exemptions for different things. If you're a medical doctor, you don't also need to be a mental health therapist to diagnose from the DSM. And I wrote them and I said, I have founded my own very humble, small religion, but I am operating in the official capacity as a minister, ordained minister of that religion, because that's what the law said. And then it exempted me completely from having to apply for a license. So they wrote me back. This was 3 years ago. And they said, yes, as we examined the law, you are now exempt. I allowed my therapy license to expire, and the Department of Professional Licensing entitled me as a unique individual who has been trained in therapy, and then said, you have every right a therapist does without having to apply for a license. And now when this came up in court, that was called into question again. And they investigated me for practicing without a license because I do call it therapy. And then I wrote them and I said, hey, here's that email you sent me 2 years ago. We forgot about that, but I still have it. And they actually closed their investigation as unfounded. And that was one of the reasons the judge looked at this and said, yes, he can be a professionally practicing therapist, call it therapy, and be a religion. There is precedent for this. There is a law written in specifically for guys like people like Bridger Jensen. And so I that is part of the reason we won that a lot of people are unaware of. I would add to this, though, that when being cross-examined in court, they asked me a lot about this. They said, well, aren't you just running a wellness center, you know, a clinic? And I said, no, we have the attunements of religion as spoken about in the Myers criteria. We wear gold buttons and white shirts, and that is our religious garb. We do celebrate the solstices. We celebrate the equinoxes. That I do teach the religion. And the opposition said then, well, why aren't you teaching all about the doctrinal parts? And I said, well, here's the reason. And your visions, like I had visions of a being I playfully called the Octogoddess that revealed all of these things to me. And she said, well, why aren't we teaching that? And I said, well, because if I teach them, that's the mistake every other religion has made, or virtually every one. When I teach them what I think, I actually stunt their ability to have their own revelations. Because when I first started doing this, I would tell people about it. But then they'd come to me and they'd be like, well, I saw the Octogoddess. And I said, ooh, the Octogoddess, I don't mind if you have I don't own the Octogoddess, but the truth is, when I used words like that, they actually started to come to me and have the exact same revelations. And I go, no, then I'm stunting or influencing or creating your revelations. And I said that in cross-examination, and the judge cited this and said, the reason Bridger isn't overtly teaching his religion, his revelations, his prophecies, is because he doesn't want to stunt the members from having their own or to influence them. I truly want to help people find their own religion under the umbrella of a protection. And so in that regard, I do feel like we soundly meet the qualifications for religion with a moral and a spiritual path, with sacred principles. And by the way, they did call into question whether we have scripture. And we opened our notes up and we showed them that every single person is having different revelation. And even when they contradict each other, we hold it as that person's individual revelation and scripture. And she held that this is now a federally recognized book of scripture. And every one of my 10 practitioners, and there's about to be 40 more, have the opportunity to help compile scripture on behalf of their voyagers, their participants. And so those are things that she ruled on. And if that clarifies anything. Yes.
That is a wonderful way to end here. Very inspiring, and I love seeing that book. Why don't you hold that up one more time? That's
Sure.
quite a Bible you got there.
It
Wow,
is. This is.
That's exciting, and also I loved your glowing microphone. At first, I thought maybe I'd gotten a little something in my breakfast cereal, but well, listen, I don't have a hard stop at 2. We can stay on here for another, 10, 20 minutes until Alyssa gets tired or somebody, but can't. Well, no, actually, I can stay on about 15 more minutes if people want.
Sure.
But what I'd like to do now, because we've got some more just incredible people waiting to give us our final blessings here, we're going to start first with Solana. Solana, are you on the phone? On the Zoom? Can you hear me, Solana? You're muted. I don't know if you know that. Well, Well, maybe we'll have to wait on that one. So Solana, if you get back on, just let us know. In the meantime, I'm going to introduce somebody I bet most of us haven't met. A couple of years ago, one of my favorite fellow church members, a guy some of you know, Sunil Agarwal, was telling me about how he felt like we should look to the earth-based religions before, specifically in connection with the holidays at Sacred Garden. And we decided that might be a little broad. But what I have learned over the last year or so in connection with this next person, Belladonna Laveau, she's the head of the largest pagan group in the world, which is a Wiccan group that has about 50,000 members. And there are lots of connections between pagan and earth-based religions. Not necessary, not unique, but lots of overlap. And so one of the things I've already offered a couple of my clients is whether they might want to become part of an established religion called Wicca, right in line with that dictum from Myers. So we'll see how that works out. But in the meantime, let's prepare ourselves for an inspiring blessing from the Archpriestess Belladonna Laveau.
Thank you for having me today. It was a pleasure and an honor to get to hear each of you speak. And so as we gather at the end of this wonderful event, where we have shared so much and gleaned so much knowledge, I call to the spirits who are listening, that they will touch each of our hearts, that they will highlight for us the words that were spoken that were just for us, that would help further our path along the way, that will help bridge the gap between humanity and divine and allow us to touch the God within and know the truth of our existence and being. And I bless this day that as you go forward, that you carry these thoughts with you, that you are transformed, uplifted, inspired, and motivated by this wonderful event. And as we close this meeting, I pray to the gods who are listening, so mote it be.
Thank you, Bella. Thank you. Solana, are you there?
Yes,
so
hi, John.
Okay, take us away. We're going to just cut it down to you. We're a little short on time. And
okay.
Thanks, Jay, for your willingness on that. Go for it, Solana.
Thank you, dear. Now, qualis cloak alciam, aisquatachi ciasiam, Solana ishtene waji, lathlimblu, smoiked hiken datsam bega ax. My benediction today, I just first of all want to thank John for the invitation, Alyssa, all the providers, all the speakers, all the attorneys, all the ones who are really advocating for a mother's breath. I skip her in humility. These words are sacred law, not content. And I wish you integrity and truth. I make these paths upon the ancestral highways of water and breath. My skipper is prayer. My direction is law. I walk not in religion, but in the sacred, where law is older than books, and the breath of Mother Earth is the first scripture. Religion built walls and forgot to breathe. They gave them life. The sacred has no walls. It lives in tide, copper, cedar, and in the love between mother and child. Why spirituality is missing is that there's a reason spirituality and indigenous ceremony are missing from the Western law, psychology, and science. That silence is not accidental. It is the design of genocide and colonialism. Those are the words of today, okay? The wicked bundle is what I like to refer to it as. His first weapon is silence. So we have to look at these things differently. Silence breeds confusion. 1.5 more minutes. Confusion creates dependency. Dependency feeds control. This is how systems born from genocide continue to rule, by severing humans from spirit and renaming them as data, cases, and diagnosis. Everything begins in the spiritual, moves through the emotional, then the mental, and finally manifests in the physical. When we forget that sacred order, we try to fix the body instead of the spirit. That is why the Western treatment so often fails. It begins at the surface, not the root. The beginning of Western sciences on this land was genocide. And so experimentation on indigenous bodies, sterilization, what have you, the rewriting of creation. The beginning of our science is spiritual law, proven for tens of thousands of years, written in our form line, in our canoes, in our medicines, in our songs. Our science is not religion, not superstition. It is right relationship with life, with love. It begins with connection in Mother Earth and accountability to creation itself. This wicked bundle survives by mimicking the sacred, by turning ceremony into product, by teaching mindfulness without memory, without order, healing without accountability, and spirituality without law. True indigenous practice is relational science. It is mindfulness with roots, with love, spirit first, emotion calms, mind remembers, and body follows. That is the sacred order. That is remembering of truth. Unfolding this Western mind, the frameworks like Myers-Briggs seek to classify what our ancestors already understood as flow. Where Western systems see opposition, we see balance. Where they see types, we see relationships. What they call introversion, we call listening medicine. What they call intuition is spirit memory. What they call feeling of relational law, this is a singularism, the knowing that all consciousness is one current expressed through countless forms. The judge said, existential humility. I have lived it as radical humility for decades. The surrender that lets Creator steer through our hands. Healing is remembrance. What Western science calls spontaneous recovery, every being with a belly button carries this medicine. Every child born of earth, of mother, holds the right and capacity to heal. May law remember love.
Thank you so much.
May medicine remember ceremony. May education remember Mother Earth. May psychology remember spirit. And may every person with a belly button remember where they belong. We are not categories. We are not currents. We are not divided. We are remembered. We are not measured. We are witnessed. I skipper in humility. I move in love. I serve the sacred. I speak for all the mothers and all the babies and the ancestors and the unborn, that may awaken again to one breath, one spirit, one law, with gratitude to the brave souls journeying right now with us in Mother's breath and true advocacy. I lift my hands up to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Solana. Wow. What an, what an inspiring way to end. Thank you. I know many of you have hard stops. Thank you for coming today. We all appreciate it. And like I said, we can stick around for a few more minutes and talk more if people want or need that.
I'll be on.
Thank you, everyone. And if you need to reach out, I'll reach out to John or whomever else, and happy to have another chat.
Thanks, Tanner.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Love.
Peace out.
Thank you.
Thanks, Deepak. See you tomorrow.
Indeed.
Thanks for the chant. That was beautiful.
You bet.
And I can stick on for another about 10 minutes if there are folks with lingering questions.
And
you know who I'd like to hear from? Bella, are you still around? Yeah, maybe not. It's funny, Gordon, you'd probably know something about this. You know, we found out that Wicca actually has an ancient path called Path 5, which has to do with potions and herbs and flying ointments is one of the old descriptions. And it's just not something that most people know about. It's not something that Wicca has, certainly on the psychedelic front, has not pressed it much. So I don't want to make that a long question or answer, but I'm just curious whether you've seen this connection before between the earth-based religions and the plant-based religions.
Very much so. There's even a much broader connection between healing as religious activity. We start with, almost half of the hospitals in America have either Catholic, Lutheran, Methodist, Presbyterian in their name. And they are very much extensions of the ministry of the church. We also, when we deal with the therapy question, one hesitates at times to mention the name Scientology, but Scientology began as a secular therapy tradition called Dianetics. And Scientology happened when they put a religious wrapping around it. And the issue that you're dealing with therapy and singularism is the same issue that Scientology dealt with in the 90s. I was there during the Carter administration when they solved that problem with the government. And there's a whole precedent for dealing with that in Scientology. And but almost every religious tradition, from the pagans to the Jewish traditions, etc., include healing and therapy of various kinds as integral parts of the religious tradition and activity.
I have a feeling you might be giving an affidavit in this case. You just blurred the distinction with 100 years of history that most of us don't know. Nicely done. By the way, we've got a hard stop at 2:15, so we got 7 more minutes. I didn't realize we had a technical issue on that. So,
sure.
Bridger, I think you wanted to say something.
Oh, I suppose I love that wonderful benediction, the beginning and the end too. And I just wanted to say thanks for that. And I also want to say we do need your support. These amicus briefs that Tanner is asking for, yes, we do need them. They will pour in probably on both sides. I do feel like it is extremely important that we win this case for everybody. If you're interested, there have been offers to me to settle this case, to withdraw or undo or ask to undo some of the judge's rulings, and I have felt so strongly that I need to fight for everybody. If this fight landed in my lap on accident, the importance of expanding the definition of religion and protecting other organizations too far supersedes these financial problems I've had because of it. It far exceeds the importance of my organization or maybe any other. We can open this up. This is an opportunity to open this up. The judge said in her ruling that America's greatest gift to the world is religious freedom. And I agree with that. I absolutely, you might expand that to say the whole First Amendment, and to have the opportunity to make a small contribution to expanding this, especially for entheogenic, sincere users of medicines that need this protection. This is an opportunity, and this is the case to help support. And I appreciate everybody in that.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, Tanner, have you been able to sign up that huge center at BYU or the Beckett Institute, one of those outfits? I mean, the Beckett Institute would be amazing if you could get an amicus brief from them.
They would be fantastic, and I have been talking to some folks there. So keep your fingers crossed on that one. They're experts in what they do, and some other organizations, in that vein, perhaps as well. But yeah, I'll echo what Bridger says. Of course, we will do our very best, to do everything we can on appeal. It'll be an interesting one because this is I would have expected the government to appeal the TRO or the preliminary injunction, as that had a lot more immediate impact. And there were some pretty significant decisions made there, but they have chosen to appeal this motion to dismiss decision and anti-suit injunction decision. So there's even questions of jurisdiction or appellate jurisdiction about what issues they really can bring to the court right now. And that may be interesting. I mean, depending on what the court chooses to do with those jurisdictional issues, the full gamut of issues could be before the court, or only some.
Did they preserve them all?
And that's another question. There are lots of questions about immunity, for example, and governmental immunity. Questionable whether they preserve those or waive them, etc.
Okay.
I want to
was there a
also
last
add
question?
this.
Oh,
Oh,
sorry,
go ahead.
Bridget. Go for it. No, I just want to make sure, Daniel, if we hit, I know there were
Let's
several
hit questions. Let's hit questions. Yes.
See, I think we got to, a lot of them had to do with the kind of therapy side of things. So I'm just going through. One interesting one, this is kind of up there, comes up a lot. Broadly speaking, Trump admin.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Do I need to say more? I mean,
I'll tell you, I just, and I won't, I'll try not to reveal my political leanings as I do this.
Sure.
But I don't think there's a lot of predictability there. However, there could be advantages, and there could be disadvantages from that unpredictability or some of the movements of the administration. And that's certainly an interesting factor here. And of course, you know, we have the DEA settlement with Church of Gaia most recently, which is
So Tanner, have you talked to Matt Zorn?
I haven't yet, no, but happy to make a connection there.
I mean, I don't know how much he can tell you, but you know, he's the closest thing we have to a sincere entheist within the administration, I believe.
Yeah, that would certainly be interesting.
Yeah, there are there's a lot to figure out here, and a lot that I think is going to happen with this case. Your continued support. I just want to say, if we can, we will send out an invite to another event like this where I will be addressing more of the religion. I'm actually going to be speaking to all of our followers and having our own kind of thing. And John, I'd love you to be a part of that as well.
Glad to be there.
Tanner as well. So I'd like to present to all of our followers before long, if you want an invitation to that. And by the way, everybody else, every other presenter, you guys are all invited as well. So
Bridger,
yeah.
Sorry. I'm just down to 2 minutes. I'm just going to spend a minute to thank some people, and then I'd like it, if you don't mind, if you give us the last invocation. Okay. So so I just wanted to say thank you to the speakers. I want to say thank you to the firm of Salzhauer and Shortt, and to Alyssa Joleigh, also to my son. Without those people I just mentioned, I wouldn't be here today. And so it's been a brand new thing toward the end of my life here, and it's been really inspiring. And every single speaker today has inspired me and challenged my mind and awakened my heart and all the things that we know from our plant practice. So thanks to all of you, and most of all, thank you to you, Bridger. So why don't you take us out?
Well, I'd like to pray or meditate, however you will, in the name of your higher power. And I'd like to express nothing but gratitude to all the earth and all my supporters, to all of the people who have come together, and all of the entities behind the scenes, and the earth, the structure of the universe. And in gratitude, we ask for the outcome that the universe grants. And amen.
So it is. Thank you, everyone. We'll sign off now. We'll see you all in the future, I hope, soon.
Thank you.
Aho.
Aho.